for you to see it.
Okay, I'm still on the 1026 meeting.
Yep, I see that one too. For you to see it.
Okay, I'm still on the 1026 meeting.
Yep, I see that one too.
If you push refresh, you should be good to go.
For you to see it. That's repeating
Okay,
it.
I'm still on the 1026 meeting.
Yep. I
We
see
are.
that one too.
We're good to go.
If you push refresh, you should be good to go.
That's repeating
Okay,
it.
I'm still on the 1026 meeting. We are. We're good to go.
If you push refresh, you should be
Why
good.
is it continuing to repeat itself over and over again?
Because it likes Mr. Annan's voice and my voice.
That doesn't make any sense.
We are.
I'm gonna mute
We're
myself.
good to go.
That doesn't make sense.
If you push refresh, you should be
Why is it continuing to repeat itself over and over again?
Because it likes Mr. Annan's voice and my voice.
Oh my gosh, you guys, this is weird.
We are.
I'm gonna mute myself.
We're good to go.
I think there's a slight delay from what's recording to when it live stream.
Why is it continuing to repeat itself over and over again?
Because it likes Mr. Annan's voice and my voice.
Oh my gosh, you guys, this is weird. I think I'm gonna have to close this out. I don't know what's happening. I'm gonna try to set it up on another computer, okay? Why is it continuing to repeat it?
I was on the YouTube channel last meeting and had to cancel it out for the exact same reason.
Did it keep repeating over and
Yeah.
over?
Yeah,
That's weird.
it would lag about 10 or 15 seconds behind the discussion too, and then start repeating.
Close this out. I don't know what's happening. Well, it's a good thing I have another laptop. This will be laptop 4 in my office right now. Great. This is craziness. Okay, let's see. All right, let's try this on a different computer. Let's see what happens.
Tina, on that computer, you'll just have to have your sound turned down because it's going to be on a delay. So then you can hear the Zoom meeting, but then the YouTube meeting just has to.
Let's see what happened. Okay, so let's just clarify. I'm on Gibraltar meetings right now, and this is all of you in Gibraltar meetings in the school board meeting portion. So that part's correct.
Yep.
So when you go down to more, now it's saying stop live stream.
Yep, you're live right now. You don't need to stop anything.
I think you're live, Tina. I think it's good.
So
I
it's
think
stopped
you are
doing-
live, Tina.
Are
I'm
you
getting some
seeing
chat.
it? Are you seeing it anywhere else, though, Dr. Cipher?
I see us and I see 2 chats from Logan Winkler telling me to mute myself.
There it is. Okay. I don't know what happened before, but I'm really glad it's done repeating itself. So that means we're ready then, Dr. Cipher. Sorry for the delay.
Very good. I need to do something first.
Oh, no.
Now I can see my sheets
You might have to do that often.
or not. Very good. Thank you, Mrs. Van Meer, for organizing us into these 2 meetings in this meeting with two views this evening. I welcome our school board members and audience to this special board meeting on Monday, November 2nd, 2020. There is a single item this evening, and I'll speak to that in a minute. But first, let us call ourselves to order with a roll call alphabetically, please.
Helm here.
Hickey here.
Piat here.
Cipher present.
Sherman here. Ward here.
Weberg here.
Thank you. We are all present. The item of interest this evening is to discuss and take possible action on the administrative plan to transition from remote learning for all students to in-person learning with parent choice of remote learning. As background, this meeting was called as a special meeting for these purposes. Number one, we have a threshold plan that the board has discussed at length, has implemented now for a number of months. We're in our 5th month of remote education. And this plan says that we are in remote until we reach a threshold point at which time students may return to school with parent permission. That plan says we go from virtually all in remote to upwards of 80% perhaps of children in school without any transition. It's my feeling in calling the meeting that the board needs to have a plan for phasing children back that is best for families, best for children, best for teachers, best for our educational delivery, and best in the sense that a pandemic will still surround us when we do this. This evening, we'll be talking about an administrative plan for phasing children back to school. In addition, because we've been out of in-person teaching and learning for 5 school months, it's time that we also ask ourselves the question in transition, what's the best practice of remote education? We will still have children in remote when parents decide to send children back to school. Do we continue to employ all of the best practices of remote education? This is an opportunity for us to initiate that conversation. Any person who watches our typical board meetings know that they oftentimes are 20+ items long in agenda, oftentimes last for multiple hours, and consequently, this kind of an in-depth presentation and board discussion this evening is called for in a special meeting. Hence, we are here. Given that background, then I turn it over to the administration to present a plan to transition from remote learning for all students to in-person learning with parent choice of remote learning.
Thank
This is Ben
you.
Meir.
Thank you. At this time, I am going to share my screen with Brian Annan. You have the presentation, Mr. Annan? Okay, you should be able to share.
Brian is muted now. He's unmuted.
Yep. Sorry, my computer is updated and I'm seeing some different screens. Can Mr. Mulray share?
Right, Cam.
Sorry, I'm failing miserably there. Thank
you. So Mr. Mulrain will be running the presentation. I'll talk through the presentation. Lucky you. And we will have Dr. Metner's in the background, and he will be ready to take any notes that the board might have as they're starting to see these plans unravel. I wanted to start with just an overview again of the guiding principles that the administration has used under the guidance from our board on designing teaching and learning in a worldwide pandemic. And what do we want that to look like? So I reference back our models that we talked about. The first model being in-school teaching and at-home learning. The second being in-school teaching and in-school and at-home learning with parent option. And the third being in-school teaching and in-school learning. Ultimately, we would like to see all of our students and all of our teachers in the classrooms teaching and learning together. That's the optimal learning environment where students learn the best, and that's where we're headed and what we want to see happening. For some time now, we've been in school teaching and having at-home learning. We are now looking to a chance to bring in-school teaching and in-school learning together while also having continued parent choice or parent option to have their students attend school. So we're looking to that second dot, trying to hopefully move ourselves over to the final phase that we all want to be in, where we're in school teaching and learning together. Next stage. The other points I wanted to remind the board, these are our 3 priorities that we looked at as we were designing the original threshold plan, as well as the Gibraltar Pandemic Handbook. And as you remember, there are many things in that handbook that tells you what the school day would be like for students when they're back in the school. So we have had a plan on what the school will look like, what the policies, practices, procedures will be with staff in the building, with kids in the building, what the day-to-day operations will look like. But what we had not done until tonight is have a plan for how will we bring students back when it's time. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Again, our top priorities are instructional excellence, and that's why it's at the top. And we are committed to continuing to maximize educational opportunities during this pandemic crisis. Our plan includes in-person, hybrid, and other learning opportunities for all children that maximize educational outcomes. And that is a big piece of our plan. So instructional excellence at the top are one of our priorities. Unfortunately, we can't do that in the middle of a pandemic crisis if we don't have safety as another top priority for our school, staff and student safety. And having a plan that reflects guidance from the federal, state, county, and local level recommendations. And finally, watching our plan and knowing that our plan is fluid and our plan is always subject to change as COVID-19 evolves in our community. We will continue to monitor all available information, not only external in what's happening in our community, but also internally in what's happening within our school district. And all along, we are doing these things to ensure that we are minimizing risk while maximizing instruction at all times. So last week, the board had asked us to schedule a special meeting so that we could begin to talk about a transition to in-school learning. And part of that, looking at that plan, is not only how do we bring students back in a low risk environment and be able to maintain that low risk environment, but for those students who choose to remain at home and in remote, we need to keep working on what remote learning looks like, because for some of those students, they may choose to be in there for an extended period of time. And one thing that we have noticed and we've talked about, because remote learning was never intended to be as long as it is now. And something that we've begun to notice is student engagement in learning while it's happening virtually. So we'll talk a little bit more about how can we leverage our students and their engagement in remote learning? What can we do more for them to help them be more connected to their teachers and their peers virtually? So I want to remind everybody that we are seeing a very specific pattern in Door County. It seems like a dream on September 2nd when we had 13 new cases in a 2-week period and we were at a moderate burden level. As the weeks have progressed, you will notice that we've moved from high for 3 weeks to very high for the past 5 weeks. So there has been a significant, steady climb in the wrong direction. I also wanted to give you just the current information from Wednesday, the 28th on my report, as well as where we're at today. So last Wednesday, when I sent the message out to our community, we had a count of 255 new cases over a 2-week period. Both the burden and activity levels are very high. I was asked to take count of the number of positive test case percentages over a 2 weeks of testing. And over those same 2 weeks, the positive test rating was 23%. I've also been asked to look at the hospital and ICU bed capacity in the Northeast region. And over the last 2 weeks, the ICU beds in the Northeast region were at 85% capacity, which means 85% full. And the hospital beds were 83% full. Since last Wednesday, I've been doing the counts every day. And I just received today's, which we did have a record high number of positive cases of 64 today. And that brings our 2-week count. And usually, you know, the 2-week count doesn't come in until Wednesday, but since we had the special board meeting, I wanted to give you the number to date. So the number to date for Monday, November 2nd is 292. So very likely we're going to top over 300 this week or greater. We are seeing this virus continue to escalate, and it's beginning to double in many areas. These numbers are very, very high. And so we are looking at that and taking that into consideration. And again, I wanted to show you this chart because the virus has a very steady pattern. Of course, we want it to pattern in the other way, but right now it's not. And that's going to come up later. I'll talk about my reference to this chart and how I use that to help with my recommendation. So we want to move on to the next. So we have 3 phases of transitioning to in-school 4A programming. These phases can be done at any time that the board feels we are ready to bring students back into the building. But I want to focus just on the plan first, because I'm sure the board will have lots of comments or questions, maybe things that they want us to look at a little differently, just on the plan itself. In phase 1, we are limiting grade levels attending school by choice. We are differentiating by student developmental need, and I'll give you more information on that as we get to the actual chart that shows you that. So that's phase 1. And phase 1 is at the highest burden levels. Phase 2 is additional time for priority grade levels and groups by choice. And again, I'll explain that as you see the next chart. And then phase 3 was the phase we already had in place, the one that we were working on, which is school open to all students by choice. So those are the 3 phases. We'll go on to the next slide and you can see what this looks like. So I really thought long and hard about this, and I have had the administrators try many different looks at it this past week, because I wanted us all to get to a plan that we felt was the best plan we can deliver to our school board, to our students, to our teachers. And we did start with rotating grade levels based on where they were in the building to keep it spaced out. And at the time, it seemed like a good plan until we got to the secondary level. And what we found out there was simply, it takes a week under our schedule. It takes a week for a student to see every one of their teachers in every one of their classes. So we wanted to make sure that when they are in person, that they're at least there for a week at a time so they can have all their classes and all their teachers. We also took a look at our kindergarten, first, second grade students, understanding that their developmental needs are a little more than others. They are just in the beginning stages of learning skills that will be the foundation of how they apply learning in their future grade levels. So we felt it would be important in phase one that the pre-K through second graders were able to come in on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays in person. And then they would switch those days with third through fifth grade. Third through fifth grade would come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. 6th through 8th would come in every other week. And since 7th and 8th grade are very close to each other in the hallway, the idea is to put 7th and 8th grade on opposite weeks. So they're not in the building at the same time. And then 9th through 12th grade, to make this work, we needed to do 2 grades per week. 2 grade levels per week. So you have a week on and a week off. Now that phase one, you'll see, we'll give you our recommendation on where that fits on the threshold plan. But that phase one takes place when we're still in a higher burden. Phase two, we're still in a high burden, but it's in the lower portion of the high burden. It's the best I can explain it right now. But in a phase two, that means the burden is starting to go down. We're starting to see some signs that things are happening out in our community that are mitigating risk and stopping the spread of the virus. And as that's happening, we're feeling more confident that we'll be able to add more for our kids in the building. So in doing so, we're looking at the pre-K through second grade and saying we're going to now move them into school every day. In third through fifth, we'll add a day and make that a Monday, Wednesday, Friday every week. With 6th, 8th, 9th through 12th, we're doing the same thing we were doing previously. The only difference is that we would open up mixed grade levels, labs as necessary. And that has to do with quarantining and contact tracing. It's a lot more difficult to contact trace when you have kids mixed in different grade levels and labs all at once. So we wanted to make sure we waited until the burden level was a little lower before we started adding all the classes together. And then phase three, if you remember from our traditional plan, that's the green and the yellow. And that's just the building, it would now be open for all students. So phases 1 and 2 would be gone. And then we would just start bringing in all of our kids at once. So that is the first piece of our plan. That's the actual phase in. That's the how we would like to do it. It's not the when are you going to do it. So we were hoping we could just maybe pause here for the school board to ask any questions that they might have, or any audience members to ask any questions that they might have based on what they're seeing. Is that okay, Dr. Seifer, before we move on?
Yes, it is. It's a good opportunity right now for board members to comment, question, and then I will read any chats that have been forwarded to us.
I have 2 questions, and the first one is, can you tell me then, I see the grade 7 and 8 would be opposite weeks. And then what is for 6th grade? Are they just every other week? And the in-between week, so on an in-between week, we might just have 7th grade, and then on the other week, we would have 6th and 8th?
Correct. Gary, and you're welcome to answer these questions too, as it applies to your building, but that, yes.
And then what happens for grades 9 through 12, where we have mixed grade classes, and in the phase 1 where the grades then are not in the building? Is that would that be the idea that we're doing that remote and in-person instruction at the same time, that they would still be teaching though to those grades that are out of the building with the students that are in the building?
That's correct, Mrs. Sherman.
Thank you.
Does the 9 through 12 schedule maintain the 2-period blocks that we currently have? I think you touched on that, but I just want to make sure that that's the intention.
Yeah, and really the 2-period blocks were created for having kids in school they're essentially designed to limit person-to-person contact. So yes.
So one other question, I'm looking at grades 3 through 5. All 3, 4, and 5 will be in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but no one will be in Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That's to alternate between PK through 2.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, we don't want to fill the elementary to capacity, so we are splitting up those days. And we did give more days to the elementary or the K1, 2 based on their developmental needs.
Mm-hmm. And does that take into account classroom proximity? I'm trying to envision where these different classrooms are on the elementary side of the building. Is the proximity of their classrooms a consideration, or is it just the grade levels?
We did try to do that. Brian, do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so that was one of our original plans, Lauren. That's a really great question. And then as we got into it, we have a very packed upper hallway right now with multiple grades all the way up K4 in that hallway. So that did not fit what we originally or what we have decided upon in this presentation tonight. 5th grade was really the only one, since they are so separated from everybody else, that they're the only ones who could really fit into that type of formula. There was many times going back and forth with the use of splitting upgrades by day so that we would have more separation in the hallway, and that's just not what the final decision was.
Mm-hmm. One other question, in phase 1 or phase 2, will elementary students move to their specials teachers, or will the specials teachers come to them?
It depends on the special. We would still maintain our original philosophy of art would zoom into the classrooms. Music would zoom into the classrooms. Spanish would continue to zoom into the classrooms. Those would remain isolated. Each student would go to library. They would go to Phi-Ed. Life skills would zoom in.
And that's the same for phase 1 and 2?
Phase 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you.
I know this is early in the planning, but has anybody looked over the bus schedule for this and how we coordinate all of that?
Well, Mike, very simply, when Rob and I sat down, we didn't go through this plan, but I did tell him, we're looking at potentially bringing groups of kids in different days of the week. And we said, basically, our bus drivers are already driving the routes, and they're either going to be picking up and dropping off backpacks or picking up and dropping off kids. I mean, they have all the designated stops. The timing might be a little different, Mike, and that's where we're going to have to work on it. But they literally have already planned every drop.
Okay.
I would just like to tag on to that bus question, which is, and maybe, I don't know if you were going this direction, Mike, but it sparked in me when you said that, is the capacity of the bus. And have we taken into account, will this give us some needed distancing on the buses then for those that use that as their transportation to school, particularly in phase 1?
I'm hopeful that will happen, Angela. I know when we did our initial survey, we had at least 50% of our families that were going to drive their child to and from school. Correct, admin? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was about 50%. I think Rob said it's a little higher than that. So if you take that 50% away, and then you look at the reduced numbers that would be coming in phase 1, phase 2, I think it'll allow us to spread out a little bit better on the buses. I feel that that's still going to be a vulnerable area, and we'll do the best that we can, but I do think that this will help spread it out.
And I have one other comment that I wanted to say when you were talking about how you formulated which grades would come in. I appreciate that you have not split the grades and done half of kindergarten this day, half of kindergarten another day. I think that it will, I think that in the 9 through 12 where we have mixed grade classes, it's going to be a challenge to do those teaching. I know ultimately that simultaneous teaching is where we want to be. But I think as we begin this transition, alleviating that for as many classes and grade levels as we can is going to be a huge benefit to begin that, because I know that we will still have some of that for those parents that choose not to be in school, or those families that choose not to be in school in PK through 8 as well on those days. But I think that will be helpful to not have it as 5 days a week of heavy mixing. So thank you for that.
Tina, have you given any consideration to having some of our more at-risk students in more frequently than this chart, or can we accommodate that for special services, or is that not something we can do?
I'm sorry, Mike, could you repeat yourself one more time? Apologize.
Do you give any thought to this special needs students that are at risk of falling behind?
Yes.
And that need special services coming in
Yes.
more frequently than this, or
Yep.
is that not something we feel comfortable with?
No, we do. In one of the next slides, we have notes to kind of go along with all this, just so we wouldn't forget some things. And one of those is we will be looking at students with IEPs, special needs, as well as EL students, and allowing them to come into the school on a regular basis based on needs as determined by their teams. So school teams would make those recommendations.
Good, thank you.
And I would just note too that we do have very sporadically students who we need to conduct high stakes testing on in the building sporadically and in a very controlled environment right now.
I have a couple teachers in my family, several actually. And some of the schools are picking one teacher in a grade to do the remote learning, and the other teachers available would be the in-school. Have we thought about possibly doing that?
No, we
No.
haven't thought about doing that. No,
Okay.
we really want to keep our classroom teachers with the students that they have been working with since day one. And making sure that we're not now reshuffling all of the kids based on remote learning versus in class. You also have to remember there's other things we have to consider, other challenges we have, which are being able to find substitutes when a teacher might have to teach remotely because they aren't able to, or maybe they aren't able to teach. If their students are in the classroom, we have to find other support for that as well. There's a possibility of potentially looking at other avenues for that, which we'll talk about. But we have not designated one teacher as the remote teacher and one teacher as the in-school teacher.
It just seems to me that would be easier for this teacher to not be doing both.
My only worry would be if we have, on our survey, we had 80% of our parents. I know that was really early and it could look a lot different now because of the burden level numbers. But really early on, 80% of our families wanted to come back to in-person. And in order for us to socially distance in the classroom safely, we have a certain number set on what our enrollment can be in each classroom. I believe it's 15. It can't be over 15. So we would have to be careful about, you got 20% possibly that are in remote learning in second grade and 80% that want to be in person. We're not going to be able to fit all of them in one classroom.
Okay.
Any other board member questions or comments before I turn to chat?
I assume that we are coming to a time in the presentation when these phases will be applied will come up.
We are going to give you a recommendation. It's just a recommendation for you to talk about. But yep, that'll be coming up next. I think we have a couple slides of just notes just to make sure we covered everything that we wanted to for you. And then we move into overlapping this plan on top of the threshold plan.
Thank you.
I give my appreciation to the administration for bringing forward a phase-in plan. As I read widely of school districts in Wisconsin, our region of the country and across the nation, there are almost as many different plans as there are schools. Consequently, there is no magical plan. There was no pre-planning of any large scale as to how a school could do remote or could phase in or out of in-person and remote. Everyone is on their own. I appreciate the work that meets the charge of devise a plan for phasing children back into in-person teaching and learning. From our chat lines, I will read what has been sent in. I will recognize that we in the past have wanted to know the name of the person chatting. I did not say that before this evening's chat line began, so I will accept some chats in which I cannot get a full name. Mike Helm says, thank you to the school board and all involved parties for enabling public accessibility during these tough gathering times. Amity Savard wants the board to know that 300 beds of the 1,200 ICU beds being occupied in the state were due to COVID per the October 29th Journal Sentinel. Mary Witteborg, some of these are statements, some are questions. And if it's a question, I think I will pause for an administrative response. Mary Witteborg points out the 2 grades per week. Many classes are mixed grade levels, tech ed, business, art, music, and some Phi Ed classes, I believe. So she's pointing at the model saying that in some of our classes, we have 2 grades or more mixed. That will require some response in a moment. Person Buckner 216 says, asks, were any considerations taken to the single or split working parent with multiple kids in different grades? I'll pause. Question.
Would you like to start with the previous question? We could have Dr. Metner
Nope.
Chime in on that.
If I say pause, that's a question. Everything else is a comment.
Okay.
And I don't think we need to make a response to a comment, but to a question, yes.
Well, we understand that there are different families with different family dynamics. We cannot create a plan that would perfectly fit everybody and their family dynamics. However, there's nothing to prevent a family from contacting the school district to see if we can make arrangements for them.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Same person, another question. Are kids off on the days they don't go to school, or are they virtual?
No, they are virtual. One thing I'm very proud of about our plan is we have had uninterrupted learning since we have begun school. We have not been interrupted by quarantining, by positive COVID cases in our building. Our students have been learning and teachers have been teaching every day in remote learning. And while remote learning can always be better, we can always look for better ways of delivering it, better ways for our students to participate in it. The bottom line is we are not having interruptions. And so school is continuing. The days that they are here, they're going to get in-person help, in-person support. They'll also get to be with their teachers and be with their peers, maybe on a small limited ability, but it's really transitioning into taking care of those social emotional needs that we've been talking about so much. But they're not off on the days that they're not in school. They will be in virtual learning.
Thank you. Um, Mary Bonson asks, do mixed grade labs include band and choir?
I'll give that to Dr. Metner.
So what we'll do is sit down and look at what the optimum 2 grades to come in at the same time are, based on the maximizing. It'll probably be 10th and 11th coming in together, and 9th and 12th, but maybe 11, 12. I've just got to sit down with Mrs. Roberts once we get into a point where we're bringing them in and really take a hard look at the mixed sections to try to optimize that. Hopefully this transition plan would not carry on for months and months and months. So
Thank you. Bob Gilby asks, will the backpack program still operate through all phases?
Yes, a big important part of the backpack program is that it supports all students now. It provides the materials that students need to be connected to their classrooms and their teachers on a daily basis. And while some students will be coming back to school, others are choosing, or parents are choosing, to keep their child home. And so we need to continue providing that backpack support to those families who choose to stay in remote.
Thank you. Britt Unkefer asks if we've looked at Sevastopol's program to see if that might work.
Yes, I have looked at Sevastopol's plan. I commend all of my fellow superintendents for all of their work they're doing. Each plan is different. Each building is unique and different. Each community is unique and different. And I think we are all working on plans that fit our schools, our communities. But yes, I have looked at the plan, and I have been in weekly conversations with the Door County superintendents, as well as the Door County Medical Department.
Thank you. Heather Green asks, would you allow a student to come in for a mixed grade class, even if his or her grade was having an off day?
Dr. Metner?
if there were some very special circumstance, but the point here is really focusing in on safety. And as we're transitioning back into in-school learning, having single grade levels in the building at a time makes sense for us when we think about how we would do contact tracing in the event of if that need came about while kids were in school. So again, the hope would not be, or would be that this would not be a prolonged transition necessarily. And so in that initial phase one transition back, we'd really be looking at focusing on just getting kids in the building, getting them familiar with our safety protocols in the building. School is going to look different for kids now than when they left in March. And we need time to get kids accustomed to those changes.
Am I reading the planning correctly, though, that those mixed grade classes might be able to begin to have multiple grades in phase two?
That's correct.
Thank you. Ann Bernshine asks, would study halls for 9-12 remain remote?
Mrs. Van Meer and I have been discussing what possibilities there are to continue to mitigate risk in the building, and study halls are something that are certainly in our discussion. We're not quite ready to come out with an exact recommendation on study halls at this time, but for a family who wanted to keep their student home, I think we could probably figure out a way to make that happen for study hall times.
Thank you.
I can add to that a little bit. I think this goes back to the philosophy of how do we know that a student has mastered learning objectives? And it isn't necessarily just the amount of time they're sitting in the seat or sitting in a study hall. There should be purpose to what they're doing and when they're doing it. If a student can demonstrate mastery of the lesson, the objectives, there's no reason for them to be sitting in study hall. However, if they need extra support with mastery, extra practice with mastery, then it makes sense to utilize that study hall as an in-person way of supporting them directly with their teachers.
Thank you. Angie Hallett asks if we'll be covering the numbers attached to each phase, and we will in a few moments. Mary Bondison wants to know, Tim, what do you mean by high stakes testing?
It's testing that's required for IEP services.
Thank you. Mary Whitteborg comes back to the accommodation of mixed grade level classes, and I think there have been comments about how that will be looked at, although we don't have exact answers at the moment. Brett Unkelfer comes back with asking me to ask the second part of a question asked earlier. Is the administration's plan based on something they have seen somewhere else? If so, do we have any idea of how did it work? Are there any metrics?
This plan is, well, I shouldn't say it's not based on another plan, because I'm sure there are so many plans out there. I am sure there are school districts that are doing something very similar. I have seen school districts bringing in younger students more frequently because of their developmental needs. I've seen schools bringing in students with special needs or EL students who are struggling. I have not seen the every other week or the 2 grades per week, but that is specific to our building, our schedule, to make that sure that our students are seeing every one of their teachers and every one of their classes in the week that they do come in. So parts of this plan are parts that I have seen in other plans, and parts they're not. Parts are based on our specific setup and our specific building.
Thank you. Christine Christensen asks, has there been a survey sent out recently to the parents about the process of how the e-learning has been going, and if the parents feel the kids are truly thriving in e-learning?
I would turn that over to my administrators. We are doing a survey. We haven't done a survey on remote learning in a while, and I know that we potentially talked about that at the board level. But I had talked to a couple of my administrators about having a survey to the parents, but for secondary, I would say more specific to our kids, and saying, what is it that you're looking for? What do you need more from us? We're trying to connect with them. I'd like to see them more engaged in class. And how can we go about helping that happen? What do they need from us? What do they like? What are the challenges they see? And what could we do for them? So that's something that Dr. Metner and I have been talking about, and something we will look to gather student feedback on.
And Jamie Christensen adds that perhaps that could include parents who have withdrawn their children from Gibraltar for other educational means. I will close with this question on this chat, and then we'll come back to the administration for further discussion of numbers and the application of these phases. Carrie Baldwin asks, how will you support teachers with the balance of in-school learning and students' virtual learning, commenting that this will be a load on teachers?
It will be a load. I think that we have set them up for success in the way that we have purchased the new technology in their classrooms, the mobile technology that can go from home to school, that creates synchronous learning in their classrooms. I have seen teachers starting to teach in something very simple that I said not too long ago. One thing you could do to help get used to the idea is teaching in the front of your classroom and having the screen, the monitor where you can see all the kids, having that there so you can see them, but also being in front of the room where you can see all your desks. And though you don't have kids in those desks right now, just the idea of being able to do that helps start with the transition. I think that the screen sizes that we've set up with these TVs that have students on them, it's pretty easy to see the kids. I would also say that the teachers are doing a phenomenal job with a new type of classroom management. They are doing, I was in a kindergarten room the other day, and the teacher would say, okay, everybody hit your remote button. And then she would do this and everybody would hit it. And then she would say, oh, so-and-so, make sure you unmute yourself so we can hear. And the kids were doing a great job of following the mute and unmute. I've seen kids raising their hands, teachers calling on kids on the screen. It's just a matter of placing that screen in an area that's advantageous to the teacher, because they're going to be teaching the same lesson. And the idea is we want to make sure that our kids online have the opportunity to answer questions just like the students in the classroom. So being able to mute and unmute, raising their hand, those kinds of classroom management skills. But yes, it is going to require a teacher to be able to watch both areas as they're teaching.
Just to spin on that question, Mrs. Van Meer, is it reasonable to believe that once we've phased in, that the new normal won't be a return to all children in school for quite some time, but the new normal will probably be in-person teaching to in-person children and at-home children simultaneously?
Yes, I absolutely believe that.
Thank you.
I can't give you the most updated percentages, because when we did that survey, we were at a whole different threshold level, and 80% of our families wanted to come back to school. I don't know that it would be 80% wanting to come back, but I do know there are a lot of families that want to be here. So yes, I do envision students in the classroom and students at home.
Thank you. As I mentioned a moment ago, I am pausing on chats so that we can return to a discussion of the administrative plan. Back to you, Mrs. Van Meer.
Thank you. So this is the plan that we're looking at. And then we wanted to give the board a recommendation on when to transition to in-school for a programming. The first part is going to be the academic side, the teaching and learning side. Dr. Metner will then discuss what that looks like when it comes to the other 4 A's. And there's a lot on here because we're bringing up the threshold plan. So please be patient with us. And I wanted the board to know that you'll get a copy of this so that you can study it a little bit more for the board meeting next Monday. So what we did was we took the previous threshold plan and we added another layer. So you'll see at the top, we added a very high burden, because that is a new burden for Wisconsin as well as Door County. And the very high burden, it equals 98 or more new cases in a 2-week period. And right now, last week, again, just as a reminder, last week we were sitting at 255 new cases. And this week, as of Monday, we're sitting at 292 cases. So we are in the extreme part of a very high burden level. And we are not recommending at this time that we would be bringing students into the school building while we are at a very high burden level. We have to see something happening in the community to feel comfortable with that recommendation. You saw from that previous slide, a few slides ago, it showed you the pattern of what's been happening in our community, from moderate to high to very high. And very high has been hanging on for several weeks, and it's continuing to grow. Like I said, just today we had over 64 new cases, so tripled our original burden level of 28 or less. That's significant. And I think we cannot make a recommendation to bring more people into this closed environment, these closed classrooms, when we are at a very high burden level. However, what we did do was take the high burden level and split it in half. And I did this because in order to get from very high back down to high, it's going to take something happening in our community, in the world. Something's going to have to happen to change the course of this virus. And once it starts happening, we will start seeing a pattern of numbers going down, a significant, steady drop of numbers going down. And then we can start looking at how do we bring our students in as safely as possible and maintain a low risk learning environment that we have. So we've divided it into an upper high burden level and a lower high burden level. Upper high burden level is based on 63 to 97 new cases in a 2-week period. And that's the plan where you saw K through 2, 4K through 2 comes on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, 3 through 5, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6th grade every other week, 7th and 8th grade every other week, opposite weeks, and high school 2 grades per week. That's in the upper high burden level. Then when we get closer to our moderate level or the yellow level, we call it the lower high burden level, and that's 29 to 62 cases. When we get to that lower level, we're looking at bringing in all K2 students every day, adding Fridays for our 3rd through 5th, so Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then keeping the secondary similar, except adding mixed grade class labs as necessary. Again, that's because of the challenge of contact tracing when we start mixing grade levels together. And then from there, in our moderate and low burden levels, as you already know, those are open for all.
The pause is to allow school board members to look at the table. And at this point, we will turn first to any questions or comments from board members to this presentation of numbers.
Question, and I know this will vary depending on the day. What percentage, let's just say for argument's sake that if we say, you know, students, the maximum number of students that would be in the building in any of these given phases. So let's say we're looking at the upper high burden level, it's 63 to 97 cases. Do we have any numbers about what percentage of our total student population has the potential to be in the building at one time? I don't know if that question is clear enough, because I realize that some students may choose to stay in virtual learning, but let's say that every student who is able to returns to school. What would our capacity be like? Would we be at half? Would we be at 60%?
That's a great question. We don't really have the numbers for that, Mrs. Ward, but we will get those for you before the next meeting. I don't know if my admin has had a chance to do their enrollment counts by grade levels on this plan.
I just, the comment I'm looking to make here is that the idea with this transition plan is to ease the numbers back in. It seems to me that even in the upper high burden level area, we have the potential for having half of our students in the building, which I realize it probably wouldn't be that high because many families would still opt for virtual. That seems dramatic to me.
Yeah.
Is my comment.
I think the one reason we haven't really focused as much on the number of kids is because, as you know, our school district went through that process of looking at every classroom, every desk, every enrollment in every grade. And we said that we can actually physically distance kids 6 feet apart in the entire building. So that was more of our focus. I know other school districts, they do try to cut back population because they can't do what we can do. They wouldn't be able to socially distance all their students unless they cut the number of kids coming to school back. We're doing this, yes, we don't want to have large numbers right away, but we're also doing it to keep low numbers, but to really test how our risk mitigation, monitor how our risk mitigation strategies are happening, and really take a look at, for the elementary, how is the zoned recess working? How are transitions in the hallways? There's very limited ones, but how are those working? What does lunch delivery look like in a K-12? We won't have all the kids, so it'll still be challenging. And it gives us an opportunity to really look at what's going well with the plan, but what are some changes we need to do to make it better? So having fewer grade levels or fewer students helps us do that a little bit better. But you're right, we haven't specifically said we're going to cut our kids down to a fourth when we first come in, or a half when we get to the next level. We haven't done that, but we certainly are willing to do that if that's something the board would like us to try to tweak in there. I really don't want to see, what I don't want to see is us breaking up the grade levels the way that we have them, and like having, I think maybe Angela said this before, having one kindergarten come on one day and another kindergarten come on another day. I mean, I want to be careful to try to keep these groups the way they are, and still give everybody an opportunity to be in the building within for the high schoolers, within a 2-week period, they at least get to be in the building for one of those 2 weeks. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I know that these numbers, to some extent, you can only predict so much. You know, you can, without knowing every family's individual choice, and without knowing, you know, there are very lots of variables at play here. And I have great faith in our safety precautions that have been in place and in development since April. So that's not my concern. I'm mostly asking that question based on the transition for children and teachers, and how it's going to work having a flood of children come into the building, which strangely enough we haven't done in months, you know, which is going to be a big transition for everybody. So
no, that's a good question. Good point.
Well, and I also think, to piggyback on that, I know of in that 3 to 5 group, we have some smaller classes in there. And so I understand why you would group PK to 2 and 3 to 5, 6 to 8, 9 to 12. I think that makes sense, but I think I'm curious at looking at those percentages as well, because I know if you've got 2 grade levels that are smaller in the Tuesday, Thursday group, but then you've got much larger in the PK to 2, we haven't evenly spread the students out. And so I'm wondering if it might, you know, if moving the 2 to 5 in together into a group to help more evenly spread out those numbers. But even with the alternating of 6, 7, and 8, we're going to have a week where you have a whole grade level more of students in one week than you do on the next. So I don't know, without splitting them, which I don't, as I said before, I wouldn't like to do. I don't know how we fix, you know, I don't know that there is a fix for that. That's where my mind went when Mrs. Ward was asking.
Other board questions or comments about this presentation of numbers?
Yes, my only comment is, how many kids are we willing to sacrifice? We've had a number of kids drop out. They're dropping out daily. Some have moved to other schools. This is going to be a financial problem down the road. We started talking about a referendum recently. We're going to have trouble with a referendum when we're not having kids in school. I just feel we need to get some kids back in school and get on the right track to returning. And I appreciate the increase of the burden number, but who knows? We might be at high numbers for months to come yet. And I can't say that the kids are getting the same education remotely as they would in person. Many of them I've talked to have real emotional problems, depression problems. I have one fairly close relative who has just quit school. Not worth it. Of course, he has connection to sports, which I'm not, the blame goes all around there. So I'm not taking the side of the kid, but still that's what's happening. And that's very troubling to me. And we're going to reap the ramifications of this down the road, I'm afraid. We pride ourselves on the 4 A's, and we're only able to do 2 A's.
Thank you, Mr. Weborg. Any other board comments or questions regarding this area of the presentation? I will pause for you, and then I will turn back to some questions on the chat line.
I would only ask to follow up with what Mr. Weborg just said. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that the education our students are receiving is not the same. How could it be? It's not the same. We make great efforts to offer the best education that our teachers can offer our students and work within that plan. My question is a follow-up for the administration to something that Mr. Weborg just said, which is, do we have statistics on students dropping out? Is that, I'm not
Yeah,
questioning what you said.
I do. I can give you what I have currently. So I just did new students for the year 1920. And we have 37 new students who are homeschooling. And open enrolled out, we have, as of 10/22, as of October 22nd, we have 12 new open enrolled out for this year.
And do you have the numbers on how many have open enrolled in?
That I don't have for you. I was more specifically looking at the families that are leaving the school.
Sure. Thank you.
So we've got like 9% of our student body has chosen to go somewhere else. Somewhere in that neighborhood.
Lauren, per our last meeting in our third Friday count, there were 22 students that were open enrolled into our district. I don't know if those are new or not, but that was our third Friday count from last meeting.
Mm-hmm.
On Community Voices, 9 families pulled their kids before. 6 have recently pulled, and 10 families are thinking of leaving.
Okay, I can only give you the numbers that I have from the Department of Public Instruction, which I received from my administrative assistant, who I trust to do an accurate job and a current job. That's all I can say.
Thank you. I will return to some questions on the chat line. Kelsey Wettig asks, will there be other support for teachers and educational staff that doesn't involve what's been provided in the past? What about mental and social support as things potentially becomes more straining?
I would like Dr. Metner, Mr. Mulrain, and Mr. Annan to talk about some of the speakers that we have had that have to do with mental wellness, some of the little things that you do for the staff, such as what just happened over Halloween, to help with their spirits. And what was the other one? And
Social and emotional.
Yeah. Could you speak to those things? And
Yeah, I'll start, and then I'll defer to Mr. Mulrain and Mr. Annan. In our in-service K-12, we brought in Dr. Marcy Kuhn from CESA 7. to review trauma-informed practices in schools, as well as social emotional learning from both a student and staff perspective. That was a specific staff training that occurred over, the secondary over 2 dates, but the elementary is able to complete it in 1. In the secondary, we have also brought in a person by the name of Jody Rose, who has given, as a staff, professional development, some art therapy strategies for dealing with change, dealing with fear in the classroom or in the school setting, and given us some tools for, as a staff, to cope with some of the challenges presented by the pandemic. We're looking to bring her back in the future as well. We've had some pretty decent staff feedback on those events. Of course, you can never do enough, but those are things that we added this year specifically since the school year started, for the express purpose of helping our staff with some of these challenges. We also work with Mike McGowan and the Project 180 team at a student level. I think Kelsey might have been a part of that when she was here. And Mr. McGowan is we're very much active and rolling with that. They've had their first round of meetings. And he even, after a principal meeting with him, put together a little video, kind of just a coping with change type video for our staff that we shared out last week. So there are things I would say that are in addition to what our normal programming would be. That was a general focus for us coming into the school year in staff development. And of course, our wonderful counselors, Mrs. Petrie and Mrs. Roberts, have done a lot of individual meetings. They've been able to set up meets, with students where we have that. We also have our Stride program up and running. There are some external resources that have been shared. If you take a look at our pandemic handbook that was board approved, there's a number of wonderful resources there for families and students alike. And so it's certainly not, I don't say these things to say we've done everything that is possible to be done, but there have been some intentional actions taken this year to address that. So Mr. Anna, Mr. Mulrain, did I miss anything there?
No, but we've also provided some weekly staff morale boosters, treats, surprise guests, daily emails that are reflective of from our counselors and school counselors that are reflective in nature and how to keep your staff morale up and your positive thinking and growth mindset. And we continue to listen and talk to staff and gather how they are feeling, and have an open door or open computer policy of always inviting staff in to make sure that they are, you can come and talk and we'll listen at any time.
The only thing I'd specifically add would be that I would just highlight the work that the support staff is doing on a daily basis. They're a group of people that we have asked a lot of, and they have responded and they continue to respond in great ways that I can't even really express the pride that I have in that group of people. They are a team. They're a great team of people, and they continue to go above and beyond in any way that we've asked them to.
Thank you. A question. Would it be easier for parents for scheduling in grades 3-5 when talking about the upper high and lower high burden levels to switch the days to Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in the event that the COVID numbers bounce back and forth for a few weeks? I think this is looking at consecutive days.
In the lower high burden level? We can do
Yes,
that.
yes, I would take that to be in the upper high and lower high burden levels of switching to grades 3 and 5, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah, we can't do it in the upper high because we've got the little kids on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and we don't want to have 2 days of the week where we have K through 5 in the same area of the building. We do want to kind of try to keep that limited, but I could see, but in the lower burden, when you have K1 and 2 coming every day, that's what we are going to have. That's the new challenge for Brian, is that 3 days a week, he's going to have all of his kids there. So
Yep.
it would be okay with me, Brian, if it makes sense to you too. I think that's a good point to switch that to Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Do you have a problem with that? Can you think of any reason we couldn't do that?
Are you talking in the lower high burden? Is that where this is?
Lower high burden grades 3 through 5, when they start coming back 3 days a week, we have it Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Mhm.
They're asking if we could change it to Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so that they get those 3 days in, because they feel like the burden could be jumping back and forth when it comes to Monday.
Yeah,
And that could
Tuesday,
mess up their
Wednesday.
Monday.
Yep. Dr. Metner can make that note. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday would be fine. Yep.
Or
Thank
was
you.
it
Good
Wednesday,
question.
Thursday,
Good
Friday?
response. Another question, well, why can't a survey be done to see how many parents' kids want to be in school and how many would stay virtual, given the new conditions that we're under? That would give some idea of how many kids you would have at one time.
I can respond to that, Mrs. Van Meer, if you like.
Sure.
We have a survey that in draft form, waiting for, we're essentially waiting for board feedback on our transition plan. And then we are ready to go with almost an exact description of that from our audience member, a survey for parents on transportation as well as in-school learning.
And Dr. Metner, that survey would be based on information presented tonight and whether or not it gets augmented or changed at the board level and the administrative level after that?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's why we didn't send this out and ahead of this meeting, because we felt like the community or our parents needed to know, parents and guardians needed to know what the exact circumstances that were approved are before they make that decision. So thank you for that follow-up question.
The next question, what are the differences in community and school from Sevastopol and Gibraltar? The square footage of Sevastopol is smaller and the enrollment is the same or more. And if the school districts are so different, why are you pulling data from the whole county?
I'm pulling data from according to our threshold plan. I'm pulling the exact data that we were asked to pull from the threshold plan on a daily basis. So that's what I'm doing. And something about Sevastopol being the same size, I don't know. They have a different plan. And again, I think every school has to do the plan that works for them. I think they're changing the plan, but the previous plan they had brought kids in some days of the week. And then when they weren't there, they were at home, but they weren't doing virtual learning like what we do. So I'm not sure what they were doing and if instructional minutes were being missed on those days that they weren't there. Our plan calls for students either being in person on the days that are designated in this plan. And if you're at home, so K1-2 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you'll still be working with your teacher remotely, just like you are now. So they will have minutes of instruction every day of the week, continuing for all grades. I'm not sure why Sevastopol has separated kids by A and B days, or I think it's green and gold days or green and blue days. I'm not sure. My thoughts were that maybe they can't socially distance in the classrooms, because that's one of the main reasons that schools alternate days for kids, is because they have too big of an enrollment to socially distance kids in their classrooms. And this gives them a better opportunity to do that. I'm not sure that that's why they are doing it, but it's probable.
Thank you. Carrie Visti asks, many of us are frustrated that all other schools in the county except for us are back in school at some capacity, even though the county numbers are the same for all schools. How do we justify this?
Do you want the superintendent to answer that question?
The question requires a response.
How do we justify it? I justify it in the fact that we are in a pandemic. It is at the highest levels it has ever been. We went above and beyond to prepare our school for the pandemic at the lowest levels it was ever at. We were in our building preparing for our kids to come back to school, whether it's deep cleaning, whether it's socially distancing all our classrooms, whether it's putting up signage, putting in automatic faucets, putting in a air filtration system. We've done everything we can do in this building to make it a low incident, low risk environment. I do think that that's why we can say that we have not had any spread of the virus in our building to date with the employees that have been in the building. Those who are positive received it outside. Those who have been close contacts outside have gotten that outside the building. It is true that some of our close contacts were because people were positive from either family spread or something that happened outside the building. But I'm proud to say that we have put measures in place that have kept risk low in our building and have allowed us to control spread from happening. And I think that's really important. When you have a community spread as high as we see in Door County, it makes it difficult when you bring groups of students into a school and you have them in a self-contained classroom for several hours a day. It makes it difficult to prevent spread from happening. We don't have control of where the students are at when they're not in school, or what's happening with families when they're not in school. We only have control of them here. And they could come here with the virus, and given the nature of the virus, it's very possible in this level of burden that we could be spreading it in our school. And that's what's happening in other schools. I know I don't have all the numbers. I talk to the superintendents weekly, and including not just Door, but I talk to the superintendents in Kewaunee and Brown County. And I can tell you that they are constantly quarantining classrooms. They are constantly shutting down classrooms because they don't have people to teach. We've had superintendents driving buses because that's the only way that transportation was going to work, because people had COVID and couldn't do it. We have whole schools shutting down and then coming back with new plans. So there is a lot going on out there, and I feel good about the fact that we've been able to be consistent with our learning. I understand that people are disappointed that it's virtual learning, but we have been able to be consistent. We have been able to deliver the minutes of instruction that we promised. We have not disrupted that. We've been able to keep our students and staff healthy, and we've been able to keep our operation running. We've been able to deliver backpacks to every home. We've been able to feed our kids. All those things are important. But you have to remember too, that even the backpack program and the food program bring risk to our support staff, our bus drivers, our cooks. And so people are going out on a limb to provide those kind of services. And I don't know if I answered the question completely, but that's the best way the superintendent can justify this decision. I have to base my decision on what I believe is in the best interest of kids and their safety. And saying that as one priority, the other priority is learning. And I understand that there's more learning we need to work on with remote. But again, I want to say, we have not missed a day of interrupted instruction. We have been consistent since day one. We are getting data back. While it's not what I would like, because I'd like tests to be taken in school in person, but the data that we are getting back is showing that we are not seeing significant gaps in learning from where they've been. Could they be better? Yes. but they are learning in this environment. I don't know. That's the best I can justify for now, Dr. Cipher.
Thank you for the response. Question, how is the new ventilation system affecting your in-school learning decisions?
It's one of many safety measures that we have put in place to have students come back to school when it is safe and the board has approved a plan for bringing them back to school. We are in a very good position. We have created a low-risk environment that gives us the best chance possible to provide quality learning that is uninterrupted by continual quarantines and shutdowns. And I feel really good about that.
Thank you. Question, do we know what some of the outcomes have been for those schools that currently have students in person in terms of illnesses, students and teachers, quarantines, missed classes, schedule changes, etc.?
All I can say to that, and talking to the other superintendents, that those things are happening on a regular basis.
Thank you. Mary Bondison asks, what is our total current enrollment as counted at the beginning of the year?
Could you repeat that, Dr. Cipher?
I think it's drawing a comparison to the enrollment at the beginning of the year and our current enrollments after students have been withdrawn for homeschooling or other options.
I don't have the total enrollment in front of me. Differences, all I have in front of me is what I said before. We've had 37 students that enrolled to homeschool since the beginning of the year. And we have had 12 students that open enrolled out since the beginning of the year.
Thank you. I think to provide information about that, we'll bring it to our next board agenda and make comment in that meeting's process. James Rarica asks, if all the preparations were done, why are we still sitting at home while other schools are back in some way? Question, and this will be the last question. Everything else that I'm reading is making statements, not asking questions of the board, and they are, it's a conversation back and forth between chatters. Can the administration commit to providing data on COVID cases within our school on our homepage, similar to Sebastopol and Sturgeon Bay?
That's kind of funny because Kaya Lutke from Sebastopol called me and said that his teachers wanted him to replicate what we were doing on our website. So there you go.
Thank you. I will repeat that there is more chatter, but it is conversational back and forth between chatters. From the administration this evening, is there anything more you would want the board to know and understand about your proposals for phasing children back into in-person teaching and learning?
At this point, if the board would like to move forward, we have another section that talks about the arts and activities.
Tina,
Please do so.
but
Please do
before we move on, Tina, could I just ask you, looking at the trend lines in the county, how long do you think it's going to take us to get the 98 new cases from 260 or 280 and continuing to go up?
I think it's a question of What needs to happen in our community to stop the spread? What needs to happen in our community to change it, to go in the other direction? Because right now we're not seeing any change. There's no change that indicates to us that something's happening to help control this virus. That's the question.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm just saying it behooves us to let our public know that, you know, with college kids coming back for home from Thanksgiving and probably staying home till after Christmas, we're probably looking at the spring semester before we have a chance to go back to school.
I can tell you other schools, such as Stevens, I can't think of the name of it right now. I was just looking online at some other schools, and is it Stevens Point? Yeah, Stevens Point School District and other schools are actually closing down through the holidays because of the potential of spread of the virus. So they're going all remote during the holidays.
Yeah, my daughter's college is going to shut down at Thanksgiving and not go back until the end of January. But that means, and most of the private colleges are doing the same thing that I hear, and all those college kids will be coming home and they'll be spreading the virus here for quite some time. So I think it just, in reality, we're talking about the spring before we transition to optional in-school learning. The other thing I'd like to add to your commentary is that we do have a school in our district that I know quite well at the Northern Door Child Care Center that has yet to lose a day for a staff with COVID. And the only people that have had COVID are family groups that have been to small family gatherings and have taken their children out, but there's been no traceable spread of the virus through the school. And they have far less resources than Gibraltar has devoted to that. Just a comment that I thought I should let you know.
Mrs. Van Meer, please talk to us about the other A's of a return to school.
Dr. Metner, would you like to continue on the slides, please? We can
Sure,
skip these parts. Go ahead and skip through these, please, and go right to.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start then. So in order to make this work with the state's new designation of a very high activity level and burden level, we've amended our proposed, or we will be proposing an amended threshold plan that includes that. And as we looked at, could you please back up at least one there, Mr. Mulrain? Thank you. As we look at where that fits with our proposed plan for transition to in-school learning, we would like to point out some possibilities for the other A's to occur. And so what I'll be doing here, if you really want to pay attention to the column very high, and I'll move through this fairly quickly, and I would want the board to understand that these are preliminary proposals for your review for the upcoming board meeting next week, and I'll certainly welcome input. But as we would look to, next slide, please. Yeah, and then the following slide. Okay, so what we'd be talking about here, it would be adding the possibility of sports, and I'll talk about other activities in a moment, but I'll start with sports and looking at some of the recent research suggesting a very low possibility of spread of the COVID disease in these activities. And with some very specific risk mitigation strategies in place, as well as limiting transportation and locker room use, we believe we could attempt to have winter sports. And so we would be looking at both middle and high school in a limited basis working. And if you go to the next slide, please. Looking at holding practices and competitions. At practices, we would look to have, and we're in our current threshold level of the very high category, we would look to have the only contact would be essentially a student would be transported or come to school ready to practice and follow various other hand washing, sanitizing the equipment and so on and so forth protocols. And then not using locker rooms. So just showing up, playing, having their practice and then going home. For sports competitions, the Packerland Conference, other schools are planning to attempt to run their winter sports seasons. Basketball is our what we would be talking about here. And what we would do is follow the Packerland Conference matrix, which talks about percentage of a high school in quarantine in order, and middle school in order to permit play. But under these circumstances, the present circumstances, we would also look to not put kids on a bus together, nor have them share locker rooms. For sports competitions and spectators, in this level, we would be looking at live streaming events and not having spectators in the gym, holding very strict, and I'll review what those look like on another table here in a moment, but looking at, for example, if you have your bench, your basketball bench, 6 feet of distancing, everyone masking, including the officials and players, and so on and so forth. Now, extracurricular and other activities, we would certainly be open to online clubs and activities continuing all the time as they currently are, but we would look at, in very specific circumstances, there was an example a couple weeks ago of one club who needed to record themselves for a virtual competition. And that would require 2 students in the building to do that. Our current threshold plan would not have allowed that. And so we're looking at how could we bring students in with very specific protocols to participate even at this level in their extracurricular clubs and activities. And of course, as the pandemic numbers drop, the ability for us to have more kids in the building with more freedom in their competitions and so on, would follow suit. Next slide, please. And as just to give an example, we would commit to only conference level play. That is because the Packerland Conference has agreed to set some very specific terms for when it is okay to play and when it is not. We would follow the WIAA winter sports guidelines as a minimum. Our own guidelines here in the building would be higher than that in most areas, but it would hold at least at a minimum to those winter sports guidelines. And I would refer the board to last meeting's packet for a link to that, and it will be included in the upcoming packet as well for your consideration. Locker rooms, home team only, we would permit with social distancing, but really we'd be talking about spreading ourselves out across both boys, Phi-Ed and varsity locker rooms and girls in that case. And then when a visiting team comes, they would arrive ready to play and report directly to the gym and then go back to their bus after the event. And we would look to minimize their contact in the building and certainly minimize their contact with our students. Again, hosting and travel would be determined by the Packerland matrix. And really what that is just so you all know, it's a conversation between the athletic directors where they report on that and they decide whether or not they are, and this will be also in the packet for next week. If they're green or yellow, they can play, so on and so forth. They have their own, the Packerland has its own matrix based on % of students in quarantine. We would ask everyone to mask, even spectators when we're in that, part of the plan as the pandemic recedes. We would ask visiting teams to bring their own water, their own supply with them so that we don't have students mixing at pinch points. The gym, we would have socially distanced bench and seating, as I mentioned earlier. For example, at like a halftime or a team meeting time, the visiting team would stay in the gym to minimize exposure in the building, and the home team would move to the nearest location for social distancing. For example, the middle school gym, that would probably be the cafeteria and the high school gym could possibly be the lobby or maybe the library. Spectators and press would be allowed per the threshold plan that I reviewed earlier. Next slide, please. Arts and activities for the board. This is an initial view of for your consideration of where we would fall with concerts, music, choir, et cetera. And also I've included graduation ceremony in here to give us a sense of starting to plan for this, because believe it or not, we're well on our way toward making another decision about graduation. And I would prefer that we take up this conversation sooner rather than later so that there are no surprises. Things like parent-teacher conferences, field trips would be essentially not permitted, or virtual. Volunteers, guest speakers in this kind of a threshold level, but as it diminishes, we would have more and more opportunity. Transportation, this was on our previous threshold plan. This would continue much in the same way it is now. We're not looking for any changes there, as well as for food service. Next slide, please. There are additional school services that are covered in the new proposed transition plan. Things like on-campus meetings, facility rental, employee professional travel. We're really looking at, and I think Mrs. Van Meer made a good point earlier when she was talking about, we're looking at getting school open and keeping it open to maintain that continuity of instruction. And so some things like, I won't be attending the principals conference this year, if it were to happen in person, because I wouldn't want to put myself at risk of needing to quarantine and not being able to be in the building and possibly spreading it to others. And we would expect others to follow suit. Next slide, please. Okay, so thanks. That's kind of a summary of where we could go with the other A's other than academics. And so I wanted to put a proposal out there for consideration to the board. I know we have a number of students who are very eager to participate in the other A's. And though we are able to do things online and do our best that way, I've sat in on a club meeting the other day where, it was a meeting just like they would have had in person. But I think as we look at, things like continue, how many more sports seasons could we forego? And I think this is an opportunity for us on a very limited basis, even in the current level of COVID in our community, by parent choice, in a very limited capacity with extreme safety measures in place to allow students to come together and participate in these activities in what we would consider the most risk-averse way. So take any questions or ideas for revision for the next board meeting?
I have a couple of questions. One is, refresh me, did we already cancel middle school basketball for this year?
So middle school boys basketball was canceled. Of course, I was making a recommendation based on our existing threshold plan. And so it is currently, suspended, I suppose. But we could, if moving forward, if the board chose to agree with this recommendation, we could consider reinstating that season for the remainder if we could make it work.
Yeah, could we make it work if we've got two high school basketball teams that need to be distancing and using that gym space? I know every year in a normal year, getting the gym space is already difficult. I can foresee that our high school teams, should they be permitted to play, will need every inch of space that they can get. I also would say, if consideration is given to having basketball season, that the priority of ensuring distancing and safety and the extreme measures you're talking about be given to the high school teams versus trying to do this with additional middle school teams. And I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. So this allowing the sports and activities could begin with the current numbers that we're seeing with all students still being in remote learning, correct?
That is correct. And what I would, Mr. Mulrain, could you back up a few slides here, maybe to the one about competitions and practices? Right there. So, we would be looking at essentially following this revised or amended threshold plan to tell us when we could allow certain levels. And part of the work in preparation for this meeting was trying to get something down on paper so that we could begin that, a first iteration, so we could begin that discussion. But I think you're right there. You point out that there will certainly be issues with gym space and times, and certainly need for higher levels of cleaning in between practices, to make sure that we're doing everything. And safety is the first priority, and risk mitigation is the first priority in this context. And so, we may not be able to do the same flow of practice in an after-school context. They might start and end at different times to make it work, or maybe staggered based on availability of gym space. We don't have the mural gym, for example, as a possibility this year. It is currently being used as a location to store items to have created the socially distanced elementary classrooms. And so we would certainly have a tough row to hoe, as it were, but I think in talking with parents and hearing from students and considering the mental health concerns and just the engagement of students, making sure that we were doing whatever we could to give them an opportunity to at least try. Again, we have to remember that if the other schools, if their levels of COVID quarantine are at a certain point, we may or may not be able to play. The Packerland Conference, we're currently discussing how we could even run a conference competition of 16 games and a double round robin. We may or may not be able to accomplish that. And we're looking at, kind of spin-off plans from there. But what this does is it gives us the opportunity to try. And I'm certainly very interested in, feedback from the board. And like I said, this is an initial iteration. You'll have it in paper form so you can really tear into it and see, kind of where you find issues. And really, this is so preliminary. I'll need to sit down with Mrs. Tank. If I get a preliminary nod that there's something worthwhile looking into this week in preparation for next week, hopefully some answers on things like gym space, and that sort of thing, and where those conflicts are. This was really just a first volley.
Are we able to require other schools to live stream only? Is that, when we talk about the things that we would require as a district, and I saw on the threshold plan that you've created is different than the one that you posted at the very end with all the sports when we have games. It was on ours, it says no locker rooms. There it says the home team can use the locker rooms. So I'm curious what we're allowed to do as far as, if we say we're not going to have our kids in any competition that would allow any audience. Can we require that of other school districts?
So when we attend or are not the hosting team, we don't have the same level of control. And I will say what I'm proposing here for hosting an event is much more strict than any of the other Packerland Conference schools. So when we travel to to another school, I would look for us to arrive ready to play and stick to our closest level of safety risk mitigation that we could, in that understanding that other teams, other schools do not necessarily follow the same protocols from school to school. Just like their plans for in-person learning or synchronous learning, their sports allowances can vary from school to school as well. The Packerland Conference principals and ADs have put together some levels of recommendation, but those are baseline recommendations or notions that minimums that we would all agree to. But some would stick with the minimum and some would have more risk mitigation in place. And I would propose that we have more risk mitigation in place in the complete desire to start. If we're going to start sports, we should be able to continue sports. There are a number of teams in the fall attempted to play seasons and were not able to get many competitions in, especially in the volleyball and that sort of thing. And so if we're going to do this, I'd like to be as cautious as possible, especially with the levels of COVID we're currently experiencing. I think it would be.
Has there been any talk about only playing within our own county?
So our Packerland Conference, as you probably know, extends into Kewaunee, Brown, Oconto, and Marinette counties, as well as, of course, Door County. And so we are so spread out in our conference. If we're going to choose to be a part of the conference play, we would likely, what I'm proposing here would be that we enter the Packerland Conference schedule. It is set and will be occurring whether we're a part of it or not. But if the board wished to limit us to play just Door County teams, I think there is something to be said for the proximity issue there. I'm certainly open to feedback. My proposal, as it stands right now, though, would be to, if we're going to enter, we'll enter right into the full conference play.
And I'm sorry, I just have one more and then I'll let other board members ask questions as well. But I'm curious, in fall, Sturgeon Bay also and Gibraltar were the two schools in our county that did not attempt a football season. I'm curious, do you know if Sturgeon Bay has said yet what they are going to do or not do for basketball?
They were at about the same point I was. I bet there's some people in the crowd who absolutely know and can't wait to put it in the chat. I know that they're in conference. In talking with their high school principal, I know that they were holding some. I don't know what the equivalent would be for us, but some learning meetings of the board where they were open to community discussion at that time. That might be similar to our student learning or other special board meetings, and they were discussing it. I know there was a survey that was conducted down there, and some other information that was independent from the school that they may or may not have discussed at that meeting. But yeah, I don't know what their outcome was. I don't know when their next meeting is. Maybe it's tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Mettner. Are there other questions or comments from board members?
Yeah, just one comment. I received a call from my massage therapist that they'd be willing to do virtual massage. I was really excited about that, but maybe we should look into having a virtual basketball game. I'm being facetious, but.
Thanks for clarifying, Mark. Questions come to us from Clayton Buskey. Would the spectators be agreed upon conference-wide, that is the standards for who can attend, or would Gibraltar and their conference opponents have separate standards? I think, Dr. Mettner, you did answer that your recommendation is more stringent than other schools are at the current time.
Yes.
But it appears to be a home school position to take.
That's correct. Other schools may welcome more spectators than we would. And frankly, the Packerland matrix that they're using, even in this circumstance, the current burden level, if both teams were, quote, green, in other words, they had 0 to a certain percentage of quarantine, they would allow spectators at those other schools. But I would not propose that for us.
Thank you. Stay with me if you would. Would the athletes be required to wear masks while playing?
Yes, and that is something that is conference-wide.
Question to you. Will non-conference competition be allowed during the WIAA tournament?
I don't know the answer to that, but we would be looking at conference play only. And I don't have word on the tournament yet at this time.
Question from Mr. Scoville. Would this mean in-person school board meetings? And I would answer that on behalf of the school board, that we will find a place within this matrix for when and when school board meetings with audience can return to their normal operations. I would say that I'm always in person at school board meetings, but that is currently a choice. Does the administration have any comments on the complications added to contact tracing as athletic teams have mixed grade levels when we are in a very high burden?
Well, in this scenario specifically, and Mrs. Van Meer, I know we have some different tables and things, but is it okay if I talk about quarantine just for sports teams?
Yes.
Okay, so in this scenario, with only having sports teams coming to campus, we would be limited to those specific sports teams and the members of those teams in terms of contact and quarantine. Of course, as we get into the red, yellow, and green categories, that would further complicate contact tracing, just like mixed grade levels would as we move through our transition plan. So I think with increased numbers of students in school comes increased complication with quarantine.
Thank you. Have all high school coaches agreed to participate? Most of our teachers are coaches. If they are exposed through sporting events, we lose a teacher and academics are impacted.
Right now, this is very preliminary. And so if we get a green light that this is an option, that will be one of the next conversations I asked Mrs. Tank to have, would be to find out exactly which coaches may or may not be able to participate for any number of reasons.
Thank you. Just a clarification, should we understand that sports can happen at the very high burden level by parent-student choice? If yes, can sports happen when classrooms are still closed to in-person learning?
We'll defer on that question. I mean, unless you want me to answer it.
I think that's a pretty important question.
Well, I mean, what I'm talking about here specifically is a very limited access for sports only, and activities only. If we're talking about a broader question of students in the building, I think that refers back to the conversation that was going on earlier with the threshold plan. And that's why I say I would defer that question, because that's a much larger conversation than just what Dr. Metner feels like in the secondary, in the high school setting specifically. And I think that was something that we reviewed in terms of how we feel bringing kids in the building en masse and transitioning in that way to students' contact within the building based on that safety level. So we see we see a difference there. I understand the logic and issue in the question itself, but I feel that at this time, this is something that we could attempt.
You're positioning these across the board for all 4 A's as a discussion of phasing back to participation in each of the A's. I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me return to board members for questions or comments. I do appreciate the fact that we've been at this for 2 hours, and understanding that if this was a regular board night, we'd have several hours yet to go. Does the board have any further questions or comments to the administration? With the understanding that this is a proposal for discussion, and we will be taking this up in agenda items next Monday night.
I have one follow-up question, Dr. Metner. You talked about the Packerland Conference setting thresholds. Is that threshold set? And if it is, how many districts can actually participate at this time?
Do you mean okay, if I understand your question correctly, the thresholds, they're not related to the burden number. They're related to the percentage of students who are quarantined at that given time before that competition. And so I don't have the current numbers right now. The season hasn't started, but the way it works would be, just for example, if we're going to play an opposing team on Tuesday, the Friday before, we're finding out when that, what those numbers are, and finding out, okay, if there's 15% quarantined and there's 30% in another school, we might not be able to play based on that matrix. And I'll include that in our packet for you to review. I think it's something that we can use that is somewhat pragmatic by school. It helps get away from maybe what's going on in a county. It hones right down on a team and on a school, and lets us know if we're in a no-go scenario or not. Nothing is perfect, in terms of, one person can, who is a spreader of the COVID, virus could be, not symptomatic or asymptomatic and be in one of those. We can't control for everything, but this attempts to control for the possibility of spread, regardless of where the team is in the various surrounding counties.
So sorry, I didn't catch, it's the percentage of the team that's ill or quarantined, or it's the
Combination. There's
percentage
one of the
district?
team and one of the school being the high school or middle school in this country.
So it might be similar to what we see with the Badgers, who couldn't play their game because they had too many people out with positives or quarantines.
I'm not exactly familiar with their plan, but that sounds very similar. Yes.
And to piggyback on that, none of these numbers that we're talking about are self-imposed quarantine numbers for ourselves or other school districts, correct? We're going solely based off of what schools have quarantined because of positive or possible positive cases.
Yeah, this would be known quarantine within the school.
Okay, so I asked that as a follow-up to this, which is that some community members who are pro having their children playing have volunteered the possibility of agreeing to quarantine in their lives outside of school in order to be able to have the opportunity to play. I realize that that's a big ask, but has that been part of it that has been considered at all? I'm thinking a little bit of the NBA bubble and how successful that was.
I appreciate the question, Mrs. Ward. Though it's not built into this plan specifically, I think it's good feedback to consider, and certainly could be something that we ask of students to do, much like we do for the co-curricular code, asking them to refrain from use of drugs or alcohol. If we ask them to be, extra careful during their seasons. As far as like staying at home, I know I've heard parents say, well, I have no trouble keeping my student home during this, to make sure that they're not at school. In our scenario, in the very high category, they would be at home anyway. So we would be asking on an honor system essentially for students to take extra precautions to make sure that their team could play.
Mm-hmm. And that also goes only insofar that we can control, or we can ask to have our families participate in a way like that. But once we're on a court with an opposing team sweating on each other, some of that, becomes moot. But just a question.
I appreciate the input and feedback on this, and I'll look for more, as we move into next week.
Any more questions or comments from school board members regarding the entirety of this proposal this evening?
Well, I was going to ask that. So that's the entirety of the proposal. That's the information we're going to get this evening, correct?
There was more information. We can always present it next week. This is the actual plan. But we just had more information on planning, showing you kind of the things that we need to do to get this in order before we can implement, as well as different quarantining protocols for different areas of the building. But we can certainly save that for Monday.
Are there things that we should know this evening that we would want to contemplate in preparation for next Monday?
It just might give you a little bit better feel for what we could be looking at should we open.
Please do.
Okay. I don't know who's in control of the screen now.
I have it.
Thank you.
think it's 2 slides ahead of, or 3 of right now. Sorry, 4.
Okay, so the admin team took a little time to go through quarantining protocols in general, as well as taking a look at some of the other services, whether it's transportation, food delivery, cleaning protocols, that type of thing. So when it comes to quarantining on the bus, even though we're through our phase 1, phase 2, we have less students. We know through our surveys that we will have less students. And we will space those students out as much as we can. Obviously, we're using masks. We're wearing masks on the bus. We are hand sanitizing on when we get on and off of the bus. So we're doing all the safety protocols that we can do with our buses. However, it could happen that we would have a student riding the bus who has tested positive for COVID-19. Should that happen, we will be quarantining all students that are on the bus, and they will need to remote learn for 14 days. Now, that student who was found positive, that student's classroom would also quarantine for 14 days because they would be direct contacts of that student. However, the other bus students would only be close contacts to their classmates, and so their classmates would not have to quarantine. Does that make sense? Just in a general scenario? Yep. Keeping in mind though, that also means a bus driver quarantines and support staff that are riding that bus quarantine. In the classroom, if a student or adult tests positive for COVID-19, all the individuals will be quarantined and returned to remote learning for a period of 14 days. So the teacher will take their equipment home and will teach from home for 14 days. Potentially the aide will have to support from home as well if they've been in the classroom. We'll also try to look at the building level as a measure before we would look at the entire district. So, but at the building level, if there's evidence through contact tracing of building level virus spread in multiple grade levels and the district no longer has the resources available to provide at-school learning, an entire building level will be quarantined and returned to remote learning for a period of 14 days. And then for a district, so that could be just the elementary or just the middle school or just the high school. And then at the district level, if there's evidence through contact tracing that at the district level that the virus has spread across multiple building levels and the district level no longer has the resources available to provide at-school learning, the district will return to remote learning for a period of 14 days during a quarantine. Food service, transportation, custodial services must be in place to provide at-school learning. If we are unable to provide adequate staffing for these essential services, the district will have to return to remote learning until those services are restored. And then under extracurricular, if a student or adult participating in an extracurricular sport or activity tests positive for COVID-19, all associated individuals will have to quarantine for a period of 14 days. Team members, coaches. And then extracurricular travel competition. If a club or team attending a competition comes in close contact with an individual from another school district who tests positive for COVID-19, all Gibraltar students and adults will quarantine related to that competition activity will quarantine for a period of 14 calendar days. That's just a general idea of what can happen in regards to each of these areas and quarantining. Does the board have any questions on this specifically?
When we're talking about quarantines, especially due to staffing issues, it may be longer than 14 days. If we have individuals who are sick and we can't provide replacements for them, I'm wondering if that needs to be noted in here somewhere so that people aren't like, but you said 14 days. And now we still don't have individuals for we don't know how long. It will be, I mean, the range of people recovering from this is anywhere from a week to months and months.
Are you talking, Angela, about the individuals? This goes into individuals quarantined because they're exposed. Are you talking about them, or are you talking specifically about someone with a positive case?
I'm talking about when we're talking about building and district closures, specifically where we're returning all students. I mean, even in a classroom, if a teacher tests positive and we don't have a replacement for that teacher, and they are dealing with the virus for 4 weeks, that's more than 14 days. But we're saying we're only going to be closed 14 days, but we may not be able to we may not be able to open that classroom or building or whole school for more than 14 days, depending on when that staffing is either available, that substitutes are available, or
I know what
from illness.
I understand what you're saying. We just need to tweak the language on this a little bit. And the 14 could be the quarantine time of 14 days, but that we would not be able to return if we don't have the services. We don't have the staff to provide the service. We wouldn't be able to return until it can be restored. We'll come up with some language that we can fit in here that makes sense. I understand what you mean.
Thank you.
Tina, when you talk about contact, are you talking about the popular definition of close contact, or just contact with somebody? You know, the within 6 feet for 15 minutes seems to be the current thought process on what a close contact is.
Right. That's true. And I know that there are people that get out measuring sticks and measure how far apart kids are on a bus or on a desk. I don't know that that's the most effective way of ensuring that we're preventing spread. We know that kids are going to get up and move around those classrooms. There's going to be incidental movement. It won't be a lot, but it will be there. And we're not there monitoring every minute, counting how many minutes kids are up and around each other. And then you think about getting ready for lunch. You think about going to the gym. You think about going out to recess. There are going to be times when they're out about and moving. So I cannot guarantee that a student is going to sit in that seat all day long and not come into close contact with another student. So I think the best, most effective way to do this is to go by classroom, to go by building, to go by bus. I'll tell you another complication that we're seeing, and this is only with the fact that we're just working on this with employees. It's complicated. We aren't getting test results back in time. You got people who are exposed, they're close contacts, and we're getting test results back in a week. And so it's hard to make decisions on who should be quarantining and when you can't get the test results back and you don't know if they're positive or not. We got other situations now that we're discovering if it's a family contact, if you are living with someone that is positive, and this is relevant here because we have a lot of spouses that work together or significant others that work together. And if someone in your household is positive, you have to quarantine with them. And if they can't isolate themselves from you, which is hard to do, you're not only serving their quarantine time with them, your quarantine time doesn't even start until they're done. So you literally could have a teacher, if her husband tests positive for COVID and they're in the same room, they're living together, obviously, that teacher has to go home because she's a close contact and we can't have them in the school, but they're at home. If they can't quarantine properly, that teacher's quarantining with her husband during his 14-day quarantine. And then once that's over, that teacher starts on day 1 of her quarantine. So that's 4 weeks out of the school for one positive case in a household.
Thank you for explaining these protocols. Any other questions from board members or comments about this area of the quarantine protocol? Mrs. Van Meer, back to you.
Okay, I think next is it subbing? Protocol staffing. I have to keep moving everyone's pictures, excuse me, because I can't see the page. Staff and supports, okay, staff and substitute protocol. This is another thing that we just wanted to show you. We have been working on. There are different scenarios that have happened or will happen, have happened. And what do you do to approach those? Just so you get a feel for the complication to this. So we've had teachers staying at home because they have a high risk category and they have doctor's notes for that, and they are able to teach. Once students come back into school, that particular educator will stay home and remote because of their high risk health category, which means we have to provide a substitute to supervise in school as it's permitted, to supervise the students who will be in that classroom. That is a scenario that we are currently planning through. Another scenario is a teacher staying at home due to a high risk category, but not able to teach. So they may have gotten COVID or something else and they are too sick to teach. So then we need to provide a substitute for them. A staff member quarantined or confirmed positive for COVID-19, but they are able to teach from home. So they're not sick, but they're under quarantine because they're a close contact, or they are positive, but still able to teach. So the staff member must remain in quarantine for a period of days after confirmation of a positive test. A substitute supervisor will have to be provided when in-school learning is permitted. Staff member quarantined or confirmed positive for COVID-19, and we have had that happen. Not able to teach from home. We've had that happen. Once students come back into school, you're looking at a staff member must remain in quarantine for the period of days after confirmation of a positive test. A substitute teacher will need to be provided. So as you can see, we're going to be looking at substitutes in various scenarios. Sometimes the teachers can teach from home, but we still need a supervisor of the students as they're in the classrooms, even if they can teach from home. Sometimes they can't teach from home, and that's when we would need a sub. And then we've also thought about how might we prioritize how we're using our substitutes. Of course, we are going to try to use our substitute pool. As you may be aware, that is very thin at this point. I'm not sure if one of the administrators has a current number of substitutes available to us that aren't already in long-term. No, we know it's it's a very shallow pool. So we'll go there first. Then we're looking at current teachers or staff members who would be able to fill in. They would be paid for that time. And if they can do that, we would try to have them do that. And as a third option, and not one we want to use, but one we may be forced to use to keep the doors open, is to provide teachers or support staff assigned duty to either supervise or substitute teach. And one thing that we are doing, and thank you, Mr. Annan, he was given the task of working with CESA 7 to see what we could do about our current support staff. Right now, if you have an associate's degree or higher, you can take a class and you can become certified as a substitute teacher. So our goal is to take a look at providing that training through CESA 7 and helping our support staff get certifications for substitute teaching licenses so that they would be able to, in an emergency situation, fill in any of those scenarios that you see at the top. So I just wanted you to get a feel of what substituting might look like in the different scenarios we are already dealing with without students in the building. Any questions on that? Comments, thoughts?
Do we have a substitute pool at this moment in time that will cover us for the staff members that we know already have anticipated leave needs?
we have covered, I believe we've covered most of them, but Dr. Metner, is it true that you may have a couple you're still attempting to cover? Or you haven't?
As they're coming up, we're working through those, but we're covered with our current need. Depending on whether or not we have kids in school or out of school, my needs change in long-term sub positions. So we'll see where we go from there. But we are, I don't have a lot of options, but we are looking at every possible nook and cranny to see how we can fill those.
Thank you for this presentation on staff and substitute protocols. I don't think there's much in this that is a surprise to a board member. It's good though to see it in print.
Yep. Thank you.
And next.
Just to give you a general thought of other areas we're looking at, our kitchen staff being one. We have 3 ladies in there. And at this time, we can provide service as long as we have sufficient staff members that are able to report to work. Should we have issues in there, it'll be difficult to keep the kitchen open. So we've gone out of our way to really keep them in a very close pod and not let them out of the kitchen and not let other people in the kitchen. And so far it's been working. Again, though, you just never know what's going to happen outside the school building. So it's something to keep in mind. Custodial staff, custodial services, things that we could do if we get numbers of custodians that are out, we can shift assignments. We'll prioritize it to make sure that the cleaning services happen when in-school learning occurs during the school day. So we have some options of reassigning their shifts based on the priorities, based on the numbers. Bus drivers, transportation will be provided when there's a sufficient number of bus drivers available to report to work. Again, I get concerned about that, and our support staff riding buses, it's a vulnerable area because you are delivering to community members, whether it's lunches or backpacks. And not to mention other outside factors that can happen. And we have had this happen with our bus drivers, and it's gotten close to where we were almost unable to continue our food delivery program, but we did keep it up and running. So just keeping in mind, we'll continue to provide transportation the best we can as long as we have the bus drivers to do it. If the office staff is not available to report because of COVID-19, we're going to keep our offices open unless the administrator or supervisor is in quarantine, and then we'll have to shut the offices. Just so you know that we'll try to keep them open. And the district will remain open for in-school learning as long as at least one administrator is able to report to school. I think that's all I have. Somebody check my report. That should be the last one, right? Yeah.
Thank you. In that last presentation, it raises I think the answer to Mr. Scoville's question, that we have a daisy chain of people who are covering a wide variety of tasks, support staff, teachers. And if any one person in that daisy chain is put into quarantine or cannot work, it throws the daisy chain out. And where you've described having support staff filling in, then as he raises the question, who fills in for support staff that are filling in for other staff that are filling in for? And that's going to be an issue we'll have to face.
Yes,
I think that is the answer.
that is the answer.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It's wide in scope. In listening to and reading, I should say, the chats, it leaves a lot of questions. It leaves a lot of concern for why aren't we in school all the time? And for others, why are we even considering being in school at all? It's a difficult proposition. At this point on this agenda this evening, I ask if there are any follow questions or comments board members would like to make about this presentation this evening?
I do. I appreciate that we're having this discussion about what the transition from at-home learning to in-school learning is going to look like. How we get there, when we get there, are things that we need to be talking about. But one thing that we're not talking about enough is the at-home learning model. I don't expect that to come right now. I don't think that was the intent of this particular agenda item, was to address all of that. But as I hear all of this, I'm left wondering why the board is not evaluating the current at-home learning model prior to even having these discussions about learning locations. I'd like to know what the problems are that we're trying to address, because in the conversations that I've been having about this move to in-home learning, there's some repeated concerns that come up that aren't going to just be fixed with in-school learning. So I'd like to ask that that becomes another main topic of discussion for our board, in addition to the particulars of this plan, that we also begin discussing what's working, what's not, and what the solutions are. Some of those, the solution will be in-school learning, and some of them, it will be changes to at-home learning. The other thing I'd like to recommend is that in hearing this plan, it's clear to me that this pandemic is not only going to span this entire school year, but possibly some into next school year. I'd like to recommend that the board appoints a standing committee, which is comprised of a variety of stakeholders, including but not limited to board members, administration, aides, teachers, lunch staff, transportation, maintenance, counselors, students, parents, community members, public health, and hospital personnel. It is important that we have these discussions on a more ongoing basis. We've gotten updates throughout our board meetings, but we really have not had these kinds of discussions like we are having this evening. A committee can meet regularly to discuss the details and then make recommendations to the board about changes that might be needed within instruction, threshold, or location. I think having these discussions on a more frequent basis will benefit us, as well as including a variety of stakeholders. We hear from them in emails and discussions we have in the community, and I can't thank them enough for speaking out. Some of them have shared some really personal details of their lives with us to help us to understand how this all affects them. And I think having more seats at the table on a more regular basis will benefit us going forward. So I would just make those two requests that really tie into this discussion this evening.
Thank you, Mrs. Sherman. If I saw your eyes moving left to right and back, you may have been reading.
I had a whole speech, but we've addressed so much of it. I shortened it to the 2 points that I felt were not included this evening.
And as you were reading, would you please forward the items from which you were reading so that we can look to those for future agenda items?
I will do so. Thank you.
To other board members, any further comments or discussion of this evening's single agenda item?
Ready to adjourn?
We are 1 week away from our next regularly scheduled meeting. Please look for a number of the pieces of this discussion this evening to appear in agenda form next Monday. Mr. Piat?
I move
Yes,
to
we are.
adjourn.
I'll second.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Piat, a second by Mrs. Hickey to adjourn. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Mrs. Eckhart, I noted 146 persons.
Thank you all.